panelists here. To my right is Shawn Brimley. He's the Executive Vice President and the Director of Studies at the Center for New American Security, and formerly had served on the National Security Council and had been in Undersecretary for Policy in that office as well. And then next down the line is Roger Zakheim, who's a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's of counsel at the law firm of Covington and Burling. Had also been Deputy Staff Director and General Counsel in the House Armed Services Committee, so he's got the Hill experience to bring to the discussion. And then in the middle, Andrew Hunter, who's a senior fellow here in the International Security Program at CSIS and the director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group. And he also has worked in the Pentagon and on the Hill, in the Pentagon at the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell, and also had been Chief of Staff to Ash Carter and Frank Kendall while they were at AT&L. And Mark Kanzian, next in the line, as a senior advisor here, also in the International Security Program at CSIS. He had previously worked at the Office of Management and Budget, had worked at CAPE as well, when I guess it was PA&E back then, and is a retired Marine. And then at the other end of the panel here is Tina Jonas, who is we are glad to have as a non-resident senior advisor here at CSIS. She had Mike McCord's job. She was DoD Comptroller back in the Bush administration. And since then, she's been the president of United Healthcare and is still very active in defense issues. So I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us here. We barely fit on the stage here, but that's great. We've got a lot of ideas and insights to share here this morning. So I'll start off, we can just go down the row here. I'll start with Shawn. I asked each of our panelists to just give about 5 minutes of opening remarks, and then after that, we'll go to question and answer.
Sure. Well, thanks, Todd, for this. Todd, prior to the session, asked me to give a few comments on this and the question of how the budget submission did in terms of actualizing the so-called third offset strategy. So let me just focus straight on that. I think that's a complex question, in part because I think the issue has been relatively vague. I don't think the department's done sort of the best job in clarifying exactly what this so-called third offset strategy is about, but although I think with Bob and Jamie's comments today and some of Bob Work's recent comments, you're seeing this become a little bit more clear over time. But I think it's important for the remainder of this administration and certainly into the next administration to state very clearly what the essence of this challenge is. And to me, the offset strategy is attempting to answer a basic question. How does the joint force operate in a world of ubiquitous precision munitions? I think that's the sort of the basic challenge that the offset strategy is trying to address. And it's the clear animating challenge for the joint force, I think, is you look at both the current operating environment and how we think the operating environment is going to evolve. So Bob Work talks about this being the third offset strategy, and it's important to remember the first was about nuclear weapons in the early Cold War, and we were trying to find a way to respond to the Soviet Union's quantitative advantages in conventional weapons. The second offset strategy in the mid to late 70s concerned precision munitions and ISR networks, and they were trying to reestablish a qualitative advantage as the Soviet Union caught up to us in the nuclear weapons balance. So both of those first two strategies, it's important to remember, focus on developing unique qualitative responses to the Soviet Union's quantitative advantages. So as we get to the third offset strategy, I think it's about trying to reestablish America's military technical dominance, as pretty much all of our current and plausible adversaries will be able to employ precision munitions against us if they choose to do so. And I think that's a very profound shift in the operating environment, and something that I think the current debate glosses over somewhat, but that's important. So I think this third offset strategy is somewhat more challenging because the answer cannot simply be investing in ways to reestablish only a qualitative advantage. Part of the answer, and I'll get into this in more detail, needs to be about finding ways to compete on the quantitative battlefield as well. And so what do I mean by that? Well, part of the implication of having actors like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea investing in precision munitions is that we quickly get into what defense planners, I think there was reference to it in the earlier panel, called a salvo competition, whereby each actor's munitions are highly precise, and thus we need to both defend against them as well as ensure that we have enough munitions and delivery vehicles of our own to pose a very credible challenge, both in terms of deterrence and in terms of actual power projection if we have to. So the third offset strategy, in my mind, requires investments both in new capabilities as well as in new ways to generate mass, numbers, and quantity in an operating environment that's going to be quickly filled with precision munitions. And so I think there are two main operational paradigms in which this competition is playing out. The first is what I call the problem of the first 1,000 nautical miles, which we get to long-range power projection, and Jamie Morin talked about that in some detail. The question there is, how do we project and sustain military power beyond and inside an adversary's denial zones, sort of the classic A2AD problem. But I think an important part of this also is what I call the last 100 yards, close-in infantry combat. And there the question is, how do we ensure Army Marine Corps infantry units and armored units can close with and destroy an enemy that employs precision munitions? And you've seen Bob Work talk about this a little bit in his recent speeches. So I tend to look at the department's investment portfolio, doctrine, and concepts of operation through the lens of these two critical questions. And so from that perspective, to answer Todd's question to me earlier, I think the early indicators of the offset strategy are fairly positive. We're seeing DoD claim about $18 billion inside the FIDUP, with about $6 billion of that remaining inside classified programs. But I think on the question of the first 1,000 nautical miles, the core power projection challenge, we're seeing investments like this new carrier-based aerial refueling system, the sort of the unmanned plane, the sort of son of U-class, which I think promises to help extend the range of the carrier air wing, which I think is a fundamentally important proposition for the department as we think about the huge capital investments we're making in things like the Ford-class carrier. Jamie talked about investments in unmanned underwater vehicles that could infiltrate an adversary's maritime zones and hold their assets at perpetual risk. That's important. You're seeing a lot of investment in enhancing our portfolio and the magazine capacity of our precision munitions, like the Virginia Payload Module, which will bring the Tomahawk capacity to 12 to 40, and the conversion of the SM-6 surface-to-air missile to an anti-ship capability. These are huge, important investments that get to the quantitative problem, not just the qualitative problem as we look across the operating environment. But I think on the question of pushing precision munitions down to ground infantry units is less clear in this budget submission, although I'm seeing some positive movements in some of the DoD labs and places like DARPA, which is experimenting with a 50 caliber guided bullet, and some emerging capabilities from industry like Raytheon's, I think it's called the Pike guided munition, which is sort of pushing highly advanced precision munitions down to sort of the infantry platoon and squad level, which I think is really important. So I think the offset strategy is real, but I think before the end of this administration, I'd encourage defense leaders to try to be a little bit more clear and precise about exactly what operating challenges the offset strategy is designed to address. I think you're starting to see that, and I encourage them to continue doing that. But the offset strategy, it's important to remember, isn't about point solutions or silver bullet, game-changing technologies, and it never was. Rather, I think this offset strategy is getting the Pentagon to react to a huge shift in the operating environment, the ubiquity of precision munitions, and doing so before it's too late. And I think on this basis, the Pentagon, from my perspective, is succeeding in making that offset strategy real. And I think the next administration will inherit a defense portfolio in this respect that is more satisfying than it would otherwise be had Ash Carter and Bob Work not focused on this for the last 16 months or so.
All right, great. Thank you, Shawn. Roger, you're up next. Give us another perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. So I'm gonna bring this up quite a bit. Todd had asked me to give the Hill perspective, and I hear this a lot now, the terminology of like spoiler alert. So this is a bit of a spoiler alert to everything you heard this morning, and that is when particularly in recent years, but generally the case when the administration sends over a budget request, it's Congress's job to throw cold water on it, and that's what you're seeing right now. And so I want to kind of give a little perspective on what we could expect to happen with this, with the budget that came over recently, and then tied in a little bit to what we can expect to see when we have a new administration in place, and then maybe just a couple of comments on the strategy. The reality is the fights and the environment on the Hill really hasn't changed at all, even with the Bipartisan Budget Act, the first one or the last one, that if you look in the House of Representatives right now, they're struggling to pass a budget. There's about $30 billion debate between the fiscal hawks and the defense hawks. Actually, not even defense hawks, I would say, just between Speaker Ryan and the fiscal hawks. The defense hawks would like to see the budget either expressed in OCO or in the base budget to reflect the FYDP from last year's budget request administration for FY17, which is roughly about $23 billion higher than what came in the president's budget request. And so we have not, even with the budget deals, we have not seen the House of Representatives, particularly this debate between the Freedom Caucus and the rest of the Republicans, go beyond this kind of annual fight over who can fight to get a little bit more than 10, 20, $30 billion in cuts. What that means is that despite having a majority in the House, they're going to struggle to put in a budget that even meets the administration's last budget request. Just when we were having the panel this morning, the Senate announced, not surprisingly, that they're not even going to have a hearing or a budget to put forward because they're waiting on the House, which I've just mentioned, is essentially slowed down. So we have this great discussion of the architecture of the FY17 budget request. You heard from the last panel all the nice and deep and important thinking that went into it. But this is essentially going to be a CR. We're probably not going to have appropriations bills go through this year, certainly a defense one, and if that's the case, not to the way end. And then with the presidential election coming into place, right, I think that disincentivizes anybody to move on this request. So what does that mean, and how should we look at this budget request? And I think most people would agree that an administration's last budget is generally trying to shape and set the table for the next administration. Some try to do it, I think generally responsibly, try to not push too forward and kind of keep reality in check. At the same time, not trying to jettison or abandon their strategies, their priorities that they kind of work towards for their administration. It goes without saying that the next administration, well, I'll reserve Trump for a second, but I think anybody else, right, you could expect to adopt what President Obama put in his budget request for FY17 with tweaks, probably going up. I think the most notable thing that's happened on in the context of these primary fights has been, I'll try to say this kindly, but the evolution of Senator Cruz's thinking on defense budgets. And here I don't mean to make an attack. I'm affiliated with the Rubio campaign, but I think it's really relevant to this discussion. Senator Cruz came out not too long ago saying that in the first year of his administration, he would seek to spend 4.1% GDP, right? I think, Mike McCord, who was here earlier, if he heard that Senator Cruz was seeking to do that, right, it's an entirely different way he would have approached Senator Cruz perhaps, 2-3 years ago. I think what that reflects is there's a consensus, again, setting Trump aside, amongst Republicans, is that the top line needs significant relief. That much has, kind of sunk in across Republican candidates. I think, Hillary Clinton, generally most people expect to be at the same, or, perhaps doing a little bit more on the top line than the current administration. Now, whether that is informed in terms of the details that came out earlier, I think it does reflect that something needs to be done here, that we have a major problem. All the good work CSIS and other thought leaders have done is now kind of registering with, the quote-unquote policy people in campaigns. The interesting piece is the fact that even with the migration of Senator Cruz's views, it has not infiltrated the mindset of the Freedom Caucus or any of the budget stakeholders in the Congress. I think that's a very important question as to why not. Why is the so-called leader of this movement? You look at Rubio or Cruz or some of these other players, they were brought in on the wave of bringing kind of fiscal discipline to the Congress, and it hasn't actually impacted the thinking of, those backbenchers who are able to hold, basically hold up the migration of a budget. And despite the fact that their fearless leader is now, recognizing the wisdom of perhaps doing more on that end. So, more to see there, but I think the table setting, which really is this budget, is one that will ultimately basically be embraced, and you'll probably see no action on it until we get to the first quarter of the next fiscal year, in which case I think you'll see an embrace or perhaps even an increase. So that's where we are, my view on the top line, hopefully provoke some more, some questions on that. In terms of what goes on in the budget, and here I'll just take a couple of minutes on strategy and kind of a little bit about what this debate is going on kind of within the defense committees. Basically, the Congress has, and the Armed Services Committees reflect this, embraced reform. They're embracing reform less so because they see it as a means to spending less on defense, more so because they see this as the primary means in which to grow the defense budget, to get at the things that we heard about last panel, R&D and procurement. There's a recognition that you can do, and I'm mindful of Andrew Hunter's work on acquisition reform, but the more you do on acquisition reform, it doesn't really matter if other aspects of the budget are cannibalizing it year after year after year. So that's why you've seen the movement in terms of TRICARE reform, or military pay, or in these other areas. More needs to be done in O&M, and I definitely think that there is an emphasis on that now because that is the vehicle. Doing reform in those other areas outside acquisition reform is actually the way we're going to see some relief to get at the problems that that Mike and others discussed earlier. Last point, and then I'll turn it over to Andrew, and that goes to the OCO. There wasn't enough discussion, I think, on the last panel on this point, but it is, kind of shocking to me that the amount of time it took for the threat environment to get so complicated with these near competitors, to start eating up more and more of our attention to the point where Ash Carter comes out, a little more than a month ago to say Russia is the #1 threat. This is, 7 years after we had a Russia reset policy, right? It's shocking. And a lot of that is, one, just general policy, events in the world that we can't control, but also the fact that when you see the top line declining year after year, how quickly others step in and exploit that opportunity. And I think what you're seeing is a growing consensus that we need to be able to operate in 3 theaters, right? These days of a force planning construct that means all things to all people, that you sometimes a Swiss cheese, that we're going to go ahead and we can kind of fend off in one theater, deal in another theater, without a real explanation of kind of which theaters we need to be present and capable of engaging. I think now that's perhaps a silver lining of all the challenges we face. We have to be able to contest Russia. We have to operate and challenge or respond to the challenges posed by the Chinese. And by the way, the Middle East, this notion of somehow we're going to pivot away from it is a thing of the past. It's just simply not reality. And having QDRs and budgets that simply say we don't need a ground forces capable of dealing with the scenarios, even though none of us want to have to deal with them, is really in the rearview mirror. And I think you're seeing consensus, whether it's a President Clinton all the way to even a President Cruz or someone else, that's going to have to adjust that strategy. And it's really kind of tied into a kind of more realistic view of the world. So let me pause there and pass it on back to you, Todd.
All right, Andrew, you're up next.
Well, thanks. Well, Roger, you set me up nicely. I'm going to focus mostly on acquisition modernization because that's where I spend most of my time daily. It's not to suggest it's the only or most important part of the budget, but it's the part that I focus on and would like to address with the minutes that I have. It's impossible to talk about this year's modernization request without a little bit of history, some of which has been discussed in the first panel and in this panel. And the gist of that is that modernization suffered tremendously in the era of sequestration and the post-sequestration budget caps. They did a big hit on modernization. It came down to a greater extent than the budget as a whole. And the department is in a hole as a result of that. When we analyzed this in a report that we put out in January, we assessed that there's about a 5-year trough, if you will, in the pipeline that you would normally expect to see for major weapon systems programs in the Department of Defense. Now that may be a necessary response to a defense drawdown. Certainly every drawdown that we've had has shown decreases in modernization spending. This one was particularly sharp, particularly fast, and also came at a different time because when we had a drawdown after the Reagan buildup, we had the Reagan buildup. And so you were able to live off the land to a certain extent in the modernization budgets because you had modernized the Army. The Air Force had been modernized in the 80s, and certainly the Navy was very large at the end of the Reagan administration. That is not so true today. In fact, for certain services, I'm thinking particularly of the Army, it is untrue. The equipment for the Army that was designed for the entire Army and for the full spectrum missions really was not substantially modernized during the last buildup because the focus was on Iraq, Afghanistan, things like MRAPs, and the systems that were needed to fight the war we were in, which is a perfectly rational, logical thing to do. But it also means that we arrive at a point today where the Army's modernization budget is substantially down, and they have a very old force that they have to fight with, and that's a problem. So come along then to last year, the FY2016 budget. Finally, there were glimmerings of pink light on the horizon the apparent dawn, the rescue for modernization funding in the FY16 budget was substantially higher. So that $25 billion increase that Mike McCord made reference to, that the BBA provided for FY16, a good portion of that went into the modernization accounts. And that was a very necessary and a very good thing. But as his chart didn't quite go into detail, but as you could see that increase really didn't carry over into FY17. The FY17 budget levels out again compared to FY16. And in particular, but the way that the department's budget is structured, leveling out is not the way that it naturally functions, right? Pay increases happen, so the pay accounts have to go up. Readiness has been an issue, it's a priority, so funding for readiness goes up. So if there's a leveling of the top line, guess what? Modernization, once again, is in trouble. And so with that background, the FY17 budget is down for modernization, mostly in the procurement accounts. And if you really dig into the details, what you find out is almost all of that reduction is in aircraft. And there's 2 points I want to make about that. The first is that one of the services, the Navy, has in fact been buying a very large number of aircraft in recent years. And actually, to be fair, the Army also has been doing a lot of recapitalization of its aviation fleet. And so what you're seeing is that those cycles, big increase in Navy aviation, is coming to its logical conclusion because they have largely modernized a lot of their aircraft fleets. For the Army, it was a conscious choice to slow down the rate at which their aviation programs were proceeding. They're not done, but they have decided as a result of budget trade-offs that they're going to slow down the pace of their aviation modernization. And the Air Force is actually starting to spool up, but they took, as everyone I think probably knows, a little bit of reduction on F-35 as a trade-off. Now, one other thing I should note about that, the F-35 is an interesting case study because the reduction really is coming down from a level that had been increased by Congress. So Congress had added a lot of money for the F-35 last year, and compared to what the administration had requested for F-35, the Air Force request is actually an increase compared to what was requested for last year. But Congress was so generous in its focus on modernization in last year's budget that this year's budget comes in as a decrease compared to what was enacted. So that suggests potentially that that the Department of Defense understands where some of the congressional priorities are and may have budgeted strategically in certain accounts and thought that maybe the right place to take reductions is places where the Congress might, in its wisdom, apply increases. I think there's a word for that called gold watching, and I can't state. We didn't get a chance to put them up here on the truth-telling machine to say they ask them that question. But that is a possibility. I did want to make one other comment about the unfunded priorities list, and I know that if I were in the positions that our last panel was in, I would have had to give the same answer they did. But drawing on my Hill background, the one thing you can say with certainty is that when Congress is done with the budget, there will be things that will have changed, fact-of-life changes from when the budget was developed. Things like inflation patterns, foreign currency fluctuations, pay always executes a little differently than we expect, and so there's always a few $1 billion of free play in the budget where things that you thought you needed when you put the budget together, you realize when Congress gets to the end game that you didn't need all that money. And so there is opportunity for Congress to move things without necessarily, it is within the top line, true statement about what Mike McCord said, but it doesn't mean that what Congress is doing is taking away some critical priority necessarily that was in the budget. And so those unfunded priorities lists are a great signal about when facts change, where is that next dollar most valuable to go. So I'm sort of a fan of the unfunded priorities list. I'm not going to get into whether they should or should not have been shared in the way that they were this year, but I think they still have utility as a construct. So just to kind of summarize a few thoughts for going forward, I mentioned this gap, this trough in the major weapon systems pipeline. The FY17 budget does not fix that. Until and unless the overall budget top line problem is addressed, that problem will not be solved. The seed corn, if you will, the early S&T that drives your future modernization, again, is relatively preserved compared to other areas of the budget. but we'll still need help when and if there is a larger budget deal. If there is not a larger budget deal, I am concerned that the increases of FY16 will be something of a false dawn for the acquisition system. And so it's going to be up to the Congress and the President working together to make that not the case, to make sure it's a real dawn. And just to talk very briefly about what challenges the next administration will face in the acquisition arena. I think the biggest challenge, there are many, and of course I've mentioned this issue of the false dawn or not, that's a central one. The second one that I want to focus on briefly is this question of adaptability. When threats and the security environment are in a state of great flux, and we're seeing challenges that we hadn't anticipated, we're seeing challenges in places that we hadn't anticipated, and I'm confident there will be challenges next year and the year after that we didn't anticipate that may or may not involve the 5 challenges about which Ash Carter, and I can't quibble with any of them, about which he organized his review of the budget. But there will undoubtedly, in my mind, be additional challenges that will arise that were unanticipated. And so you need an acquisition system that is agile and adaptable, and those are not phrases that one normally hears in association with the Department of Defense acquisition system. Now, I will say that it can do it. It has done it at times. The rapid acquisition experience demonstrated that. More recently, the decision to upgun strikers with a more capable gun in response to some of the things happening in Europe. And as has been mentioned a couple of times, the decision to modify the way the SM-6 is employed is an example of a case where, in fact, the acquisition system has proven that it can adapt pretty rapidly in acquisition terms to changes in the world. But that will remain a central challenge for the next administration. And just one last comment that in some ways, there's some irony in the fact that one of the biggest conflicts in this whole budget development has been between OSD and the Navy. Because in many ways, I would say the Navy has pioneered, as demonstrated by the SM-6, some of this question about adaptability and about leveraging the platforms you have with small investments to get a better return and new capabilities. And so it may be one of those cases where in some ways, like mines, we may argue more because they get down into the really fine details. But I think those are the 2 big challenges for the next administration.
All right. So Mark, you're up next.
Well, thank you. I'll talk a little about forces, and of course there are many issues on the forces. I'll talk about one overarching theme and then look at some individual issues for the particular services. The overarching theme I think you're going to hear over the next year or so on forces is whether there's a gap between the strategy and the size of the forces that are planned. The current force sizing was done in 2013. That was before we saw a very aggressive China in the South China Sea, before you have Russian aggression in Ukraine, and then threats to the Baltics, now in Syria, of course, and the battlefield successes of ISIS. Plus, in the background, of course, you have Iran and North Korea. So one of the arguments is that the world has changed. The administration's force plans have not changed, and that gap has opened up. Sometimes you hear this discussion in code words, posture versus presence, or capacity versus capability. You heard a little of that this morning with our panelists, and I think you heard some of the tension that exists there. The administration initially took the position that they were going to emphasize posture rather than presence. In other words, they were going to have better stuff rather than more stuff. But they got a lot of pushback on that. When the CNO, Admiral Richardson, expressed that in his guidance to the Navy, there was a lot of pushback that he hadn't mentioned presence and that this was a major change in what the Navy had done and was leaving maybe some of our allies uncovered, so he backtracked. And I think you saw it in the panel in that, I think it was McCord's slides, he talks about emphasizing posture rather than presence, but when Bob Scher talked, he said, well, no, we're emphasizing both of them. So this tension, I think, is in the administration, and you'll see it played out on the Hill. Looking at the individual services, we can start with the Army, and this tension plays out in the Army. General Odierno, the previous chief, had been really quite outspoken about his concerns that the Army was getting to be too small. And you've seen some proposed legislation on the Hill to stop the Army's drawdown. The Army active Army has come down from like 530 down to 490. They're going to 470, I think, this year, and then plan next year going down to 460, ultimately to 450. And there are comparable reductions to the Guard and Reserve. The legislation would freeze the Army drawdown. Now, that may not get enacted, but it indicates a concern on the Hill and in the Congress. The other thing I think you'll see played out in the Army is maybe some easing of the Civil War within the Army and its components. The Army, of course, has both the Guard and the Reserves, as well as the active or regular forces, they're referring to it now. There's been tension there since the beginning of the Republic. You can go back to George Washington, and he complains about the militia. So the fact that there are tensions now is nothing new. But it flared up about 2 years ago when some regular officers had raised questions about the usability, particularly of Guard combat units, in the kind of scenarios that they were facing and proposing or suggesting that maybe there'd be some cutbacks there. The Guard was being very politically connected, pushed back. There was this commission on the future of the Army, and they made a number of recommendations to try to integrate the components better and to ease some of the tensions there. Many of those will cost money, but if there's more money available, that might help. They had some ideas, for instance, about Apaches, where the rub had been particularly sensitive. Money can be a great lubricant and ease a lot of tensions. So I think if the Congress steps in and provides a little more money for the Army, that may ease this Civil War. If you look at the Navy, of course, they got a lot of attention when the Secretary sent them a memo cutting the LCS program, and that really captured many of these concerns about posture versus presence, LCS being designed to have some warfighting capability, but I think it's fair to say that has been a disappointment, what it has produced, but it would give you a lot of presence, so that sending a $700, $800 million ship instead of a $2 billion destroyer. The Secretary had told them to cut back on that. There's been pushback because of concerns that the Navy ship count is getting to be too small for all the places that the Navy needs to be. This plays out also with the cruisers. The Navy had proposed essentially deactivating some cruisers. The Congress has forbidden them from doing that. The other place I think you'll see some issues in the Navy is regarding carriers, and Shawn talked about that a little with the U-class, this unmanned aircraft that the Navy had designed. They decided not to produce it as a production aircraft, but to turn it into a tanker called C-Bars. There's also, I think, some interest in calling it Stingray. So whatever we're calling it this month, I think it will be the center of a lot of discussion about the carriers, because there's been an enormous debate about the role of the carriers going forward. Clearly, they're very useful in day-to-day operations and contingency operations. A lot of questions about their usefulness in a conflict with a peer competitor, for example, one on the eastern edge of the Asian mainland. So I think you'll see that played out, because an unmanned aircraft would give the carrier a much greater range. As Shawn pointed out, right now its air wing is very short-legged, whereas back in the 80s, the air wing used to have a range of about 1,000 miles. Now it's down to about 500, and this is at a time when you're getting close to a peer competitor is going to be extremely dangerous. This U-class might have bridged that gap. The Navy decided it could not buy both the F-35 and this unmanned aircraft, and decided to go with the short-range F-35. Looking at some of the other services of the Air Force, I think you're seeing this played out again, centers around the A-10. There's, of course, a lot of active reserve politics around that, but part of the issue is, what do you want the Air Force to be able to do? If you want it to be able to penetrate very sophisticated air defenses against peer competitors, A-10 can't do that for you. It's much too vulnerable. You need to move to the F-35 and fifth-generation aircraft. On the other hand, if you want to drop bombs on insurgents or in environments with a less sophisticated air defense network like North Korea, A-10 can be great because it's designed for exactly that kind of purpose. The Air Force had wanted to retire the fleet. The Congress has required them to keep them active. And you'll see the dynamics of capacity capability played out there in the Air Force. Finally, you got the Marine Corps. I think one of the things you're seeing with the Marine Corps on its amphibious ships is a lot of innovation in the way that they use ships and they organize themselves. Traditionally, the Marine Corps, of course, had put units, MUs, on amphibious ships and deployed those around the globe. Now they're using non-amphibious ships. Some of the, what had been logistic ships, the AFSBs, the MLPs, in very innovative ways. They've also created these special purpose MAGTFs to meet certain requirements around the globe that are not necessarily tied to amphibious ships. So I think you're going to see more of that as the Marine Corps both tries to maintain a strong amphibious ship under the classic L-class, but also take advantage of some of these other capabilities to meet the many demands that are being put on them where regular amphibious ships are not available. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tina.
Great, thank you very much. So I think you've heard many of these topics, and I would just, add my, absolutely, I think with force sizing and force structure, you're already seeing a lot of conversation on Capitol Hill. We had a couple of witnesses just recently asked, what would it take? And the price tag is 30 to 50 billion. So obviously this is a great, outstanding question. And so more to come. If we're living under a CR this year, obviously that's not going to happen. But with an incoming administration, that will get relitigated in my judgment. I agree with Mark. Again, on our naval forces, the ship count is always an issue, but I think a lot of concern around the 280 right now. We had some discussion about the carrier, an additional carrier. Those are all huge items, big ticket items. We touched on the nuclear modernization. We have not touched on space. There was a big ad last year recently on space. They put another $1.8 billion for space launch in, but I think that's an area of future consideration depending upon how our constellations hold up and what needs to be done there. We talked about cyber. So I completely agree with the panel here, and I will add that Andrew is very familiar with the gamesmanship that goes on, and if you look at the appropriation structure, it conveniently is -6 to the procurement accounts, +6 to the O&M accounts. So a little bit of standard gamesmanship going on there, but so I think those are the big ticket items. Areas of reform that are a question mark currently and for this Congress are what will the Congress take on the next step? They took on military retirement last year. Will they take a next step on health care reform? If the administration is counting about $3 billion worth of savings for their health care proposals this year. It depends on what the Congress does with it. They have attempted to simplify the TRICARE healthcare structure, but again, their assumptions and proposals are going to be looked at, I'm sure, very carefully by both committees, particularly in a political year. And again, if we end up under a CR, that is something that will probably get kicked to the next administration. So that's kind of my list. The force of the future, I know there's been a lot of talk around that, what that actually results in terms of savings. I think Mike suggested it wasn't going to be much, and I know that many of you track the hearings. I think they've been kind of hit with a particular thud in one Senate Armed Services Committee. So who knows what will happen on that. The relationships Roger talked about, and about the broader context in the budget committees. Are we plus than 30 billion up, or are we going to reduce? It's the hawks against the defense hawks against the deficit hawks. So who knows how that'll all turn out. But those are my lists, and I would say I think the acquisition reform proposals last year were good. The question in my mind is, how will the Defense Department make use of those proposals? Are they going to be innovative? And in the last year of an administration, people are tackling many issues, and it's may not get full use, but I would defer to Andrew. He's the expert there.
All right, thank you all. And so I'll go right to questions from the audience. If you've got a question, put up your hand. We'll bring around a microphone to you. We've got one up here.
Sinclair Harris, retired sailor. But this is not a naval question. This is more of a joint question. And it's one that I guess the survey is going to be interesting to see what the results are for that. So we're talking about joint force reform. And I've been a joint staff officer twice in my time. Where do each of you think this needs to go in terms of a revised Goldwater nickel? Are we talking specifically about whatever savings we might reap from Northcom and Southcom, or EUCOM and AFRICOM being reunited as one? Are we talking about greater ambitions in terms of reducing the number of flag and general officers because of the way we're connected now? Where do you think this joint force conversation, Goldwater's Nichols 2, needs to go? And if you get there, how much do you think you're actually going to save? Over.
All right, Mark, you want to start on that?
I was going to start because it's a great introduction to our panel next week. CSIS put out some analysis on all of the testimony that has been produced by the SASC on this question, and I recommend you take a look at that, because the bottom line that comes out is that there's a lot of concern about the agility of the department, including the joint staff, to make strategic decisions. But there's really no consensus about how to bring that about. There are proposals to merge Northcom and Southcom, maybe put AFRICOM back into EUCOM, but then there are also proposals to create new COCOMs for cyber and space, and others that oppose taking the focus off of AFRICOM or Southcom. And the same way with the joint staff, proposals to increase its reach, proposals to decrease its reach. So bottom line, I think there's a lot of interest in improving strategy formulation, but no real consensus about how to do that across the board or with the joint staff.
Roger?
Real quick, and I've kind of seen this, what outcome we're trying to achieve. One is we just need to have, looking at the force, more people on the kind of tip end of the spear, right? The fighting force. There's too much kind of back end. And so that's one outcome that I know Senator McCain, Chairman Thornberry are emphasizing. Methodology in terms of how you get there, and agreement in terms of who is and who is not truly doing something that's a tip end of the spear is quite philosophical and not widespread agreement. Then there's a cost component, and I'm mindful of Secretary Gates, like we're just going to get rid of GIFCOM, right? And so that was just waste or unnecessary, and we can get rid of it. And all of a sudden you found GIFCOM hanging out in the joint staff, and there wasn't any cost savings, very little to show for it. Even Secretary Gates, when he references the growth in general officers and flag officers, and even though the commands under them have either been removed or reduced, he's just going, well, maybe it doesn't require a 4-star. I believe he achieved 10% of his goal. Right? The Secretary of Defense, who just published a book on management, how to deal with bureaucracy and how to achieve outcomes, essentially wasn't even close to accomplishing his goal on it. So, broad notions of what we want to achieve. The challenge is in executing and figuring out how to do it, and I don't see anybody who's figured out how to solve that. So mark me down as skeptical whether we'll get there.
Yeah,
Shawn?
very, very quickly for me, that's why my microphone. Thank you. For me, I think the question is, what is the problem you're trying to solve, right? And I think that, and I haven't quite seen that from anybody thinking about this, which I think is somewhat problematic. They're still trying to figure out exactly what problem exists and they're focusing on as they're thinking about marking up legislation, I think, inside of the next 2 months. So it's a pretty sporty uncertain dynamic. And I think it's important to remember, look, the original Goldwater-Nichols legislation was about getting jointness forward. And I think it's fair to say, 30 years after the fact, that has been achieved. I think where there's room for debate is how that legislation has impacted the question of jointness in terms of inside the Beltway, inside the Pentagon, services, the Joint Staff, OSD. And I think there, the focus ought to be on, how do we make sure that jointness forward doesn't necessarily come at the cost of the competition of ideas inside the Pentagon. And I think that's where you see a lot of debate right now. The Joint Staff's at 4,000 billets, OSDs at 5,000 billets. These are orders of magnitude greater than they were 30 years ago. And I don't even know where the services are. And you've got the combatant commands as well. And I think that's an issue area sort of ripe for examination. I was on the Efficiencies Task Force in the early years of the Obama administration. We're supporting it as Secretary Gates tried to look at this. Made some progress, but there's so much more that could be done. So my sort of advice to those folks on the Hill would be to look inside the question of what we sort of broadly call the fourth estate inside the Pentagon. And there, I think there are lots of interesting things you could do, but I think it's important, the first proposition ought to be do no harm. So some of this debate that I'm seeing about the role of the chairman and authorities vis-a-vis the COCOMs, I think we need to be very, very, very careful to really game out the second and third order effects of what I would call relatively galactic changes in how we think about the command structure. There's lots of things you could do that are relatively low-hanging fruit that I think you could look at. But I worry a little bit about this sort of push for rapid legislation that could be looking at some of these, relatively, what I would think is relatively effective command relationships between the chairman and the secretary and the president and all the way down with the combatant commands. I worry a little bit about some of the things that I'm hearing and how quickly you could potentially reset some of those relationships to address a problem statement that I'm not quite sure really is shared among the folks looking at the issue.
Andrew.
I always say my habit is to be the optimist. Let me be the pessimist for a moment here. Because I think it's not just that the objectives are unclear. I think it's that people have expressed objectives that are actually in tension with one another as if they were complementary. And I think that there's an important respect at which they aren't. So I think efficiency is a very worthwhile and valuable objective that has been put forward by many as a possible objective for this Goldwater-Nichols 2.0 effort. You've also had folks who talk about the incredibly complex strategic environment they're in, which we've spent most of the morning talking about, and that the need is to be more agile and adaptive in responding to that. And I do believe that there is an important respect in which those two things are in tension with one another. Now, if you think about the first Goldwater-Nichols, where the focus was on improving joint warfighting, it took a lot of extra resources to really focus on that. You created new structures in the Joint Staff, new structures in the combatant commands to achieve that objective. We made new investments in interoperability and weapon systems to achieve those objectives. And it was, I think, probably would not have been as successful as it has been if the focus had been, and we're going to do all that for less money than what we had done before. So I think there is I think of the successes that we have had in being agile and adaptive. The European Reassurance Initiative is a case where we were able to respond. We were caught flat-footed, but to the extent that we have responded, we've responded largely by, let me just say, throwing money at the problem. Sometimes throwing the money at the problem is the right answer. So I just think that as we go through this debate about Goldwater-Nichols 2, if it's all about efficiencies across the board, then I think some of the problems that have been identified about being more agile, adaptive, and strategically relevant will become second priorities, second bananas. And so I think we just have to be very clear-minded in what the real thrust of this is.
All right, next question here.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Jim Byrne. I was a journalist, retired journalist who covered procurement issues in all the federal agencies for many years. And I just picked up this morning the current issue of the Washington Examiner magazine. They have a story here, and you've talked about it here just now, fixing a national security crisis. And then it quotes McCain as saying, the military's technological advantage is eroding and eroding fast, precisely at the time the world's on fire. And then it spends most of its time discussing some of the issues you brought up here about how complicated the that their attempt, Thornberry and McCain's attempt is to upgrade or modernize the Goldwater reforms of 25 years ago. So I'm wondering, A, do you think that quote of McCain's is on the money or a little extreme? And what is the outlook for getting something out of this effort to upgrade the the Goldwater reform?
All right. Who wants to take a shot? Who wants to grade McCain's statements?
I'll answer his question. I'm not sure it was a grading of Senator McCain. McCain generally, kind of evokes the attention of journalists, and mostly it's because he has quotes like that. And I think there's a lot of element of truth to it, even though there's some hyperbole there. But we are in a vicious cycle. You have the Middle East and the challenges, kind of the low-end threats continue to mount a tremendous strain on our military. It's not going away for the foreseeable future. At the same time, you have the stuff that folks in this panel, last panel, were talking about, the investments that Russia and China have made that is exploiting our vulnerabilities and exposes the fact that we haven't really invested in modernization since the period that Ronald Reagan was in office. We could live in the fiction like we did the beginning of this administration and the previous administrations before him, that those issues aren't a problem for us, right? We're just going to we're not really concerned about Russia. We can kind of rely on our economic relations with the Chinese, and we're going to just withdraw from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we'll be okay, actually, with less of investment, and kind of reality set in. And in both accounts, we have a significant challenge. So in that respect, Senator McCain, I think, is spot on. The notion that somehow you need a Goldwater Nichols to get there, too, doesn't. I think there are a number of things we have to do first, and I think we could do a lot to get after the challenges posed by China and Russia and the threat posed by ISIS without even getting to Goldwater Nichols. And I think my concern is, relevant, important thing to do, but I think some of the resource issues, as well as just getting after some of the planning and focus on warfighting as opposed to managing budget control acts from year to year would go a long way to stabilizing our security.
All right. Right here. Next question.
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. This two-year budget agreement was supposed to bring some stability to the DoD budget, but the panel has raised the possibility of having another CR. So I was just hoping each of you could weigh in and talk about what you think the odds are that the FY17 budget will be passed before the end of the FY16, or whether you think there will, in fact, be a CR. Thanks.
I think it's safe to say we'll start the year on a continuing resolution because there's a long track record of doing that with not too many exceptions. Although I think, Tina, when you were in DoD, there might have been a couple of years where
I think we had a couple regular years.
Yeah.
But we had to manage the cash problem as well.
So given that it may be a foregone conclusion that we start the year on a CR, what is the impact this year? What do you see coming down the line? And I mean, acquisition programs are a good place to start.
I'd be happy to start. I mean, so acquisition, CRs are particularly problematic for acquisition in a couple of ways. One is they tend to put a lot of things on hold. So anything that was new starts or new dramatic expansions, programs transitioning into production, all of that essentially is put on hold during the duration of a CR. Depends a little bit on the length of a CR. A lot of those types of things tend not to happen in the first quarter of the fiscal year anyway. That's maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but generally the way OMB rolls the money down the pike, they apportion it to the department, and it takes weeks to months to kind of really get programs teed up to get to that next stage after the budget's passed. So if it's a 3-month CR, I think the impacts are real but fairly minor. When you start talking about a 6-month CR, which we've certainly experienced in recent years, then it becomes incredibly disruptive because it's almost like that extra 3 months is almost like losing most of the year because it puts you so far behind the 8 ball of getting those contracts let and getting activity started. So it's one of those rare cases. It's also particularly hard, as I've as I mentioned in the past, for the acquisition system, because it's a multi-year planning exercise. When you're working on an acquisition program, you've got a 30-year plan for how that program's going to roll out. And certainly when you're in the early stages, it's at least a 10-year time horizon that you're trying to plan for. So when you get these, potentially year-long disruptions that come seemingly at random, it really undermines the effectiveness of the system.
Well, comment, just taking it back. So the 3 months versus 6 months is certainly true, and I think anybody who manages the money in DoD would agree with that. I think the opportunity, and this is where I'll be half glass full, is with the presidential election. We haven't had a structural change in the politics that has delivered us the Budget Control Act and sequestration since that was enacted. Some thought with Republicans controlling majorities in both the House and the Senate, you might actually see a different outcome. The reason why you haven't is because I didn't reach the 60-vote threshold. I think if you're looking at just through the lens of the Department of Defense, what they need here is a new political reality. They need a new president in place, which they'll get, one form or another, and then some shift in the Congress. The Senate's in play, depending on who the Republican nominee is. I think a lot of people feel the House is in play. And that will allow, in the same way John Boehner left and Paul Ryan came in and they got the Bipartisan Budget Act, right? It ends up just being a one-year deal because the Freedom Caucus came back in and kind of wanted to renegotiate again. I mean, that conduct will potentially end with the new president in place. Of course, it's really, we haven't discussed it, but really, we're in this world and it's 50% discretionary, but really 17% of total spending. The forces that have driven us to this type of budget-constrained discussion are things that happen outside defense. And so the major question is, when you have a new administration, will that president basically have support in Congress to say, we're not going to do overhaul of Medicare and Social Security, kind of the entitlement programs, because I'm comfortable where the economy is, just to lift discretionary spending? Or in the case of a Republican administration, will they actually put their money where their mouth is? And we'll actually see some movement on the drivers of the deficit, the drivers of the spending. And in this respect, Republicans are very poor on that. I mean, they have not shown the ability to actually even move legislation. I mean, Paul Ryan wants to do this. That actually hints to what the Republicans may do if they were to be in the White House in 2017. That is what has to happen. Otherwise, we'll be having the same conversation, 6 to 9 months from now.
So let me follow up quickly. So one of the debates going on now with the House Budget Committee is, well, the defense hawks want to add more for defense. Well, the way you would do that under this budget deal is to add more OCO. There's nothing limiting. There's not an enforcement mechanism.
Despite what Mike said, that was a little, I don't know,
well,
revisit that, but
there's no
I agree with
enforcement
you.
mechanism
I agree
to
with
limit OCO, even in the budget deal. It did say $59 billion for defense, but okay. So if you want to add another, $18 billion or so, I think it's been talked about in OCO. The problem is in the House Republican caucus right now that some of the Freedom Caucus folks are saying that they won't go along with it. So the strategy has been floated that maybe you wait and have an additional OCO request in the next administration. So you basically punt on OCO and wait until a new administration and a new Congress takes office and then try to take up a higher OCO level of funding then. What do people think about that? What are the odds of success? It's very uncertain what would happen because it depends on the election. But yeah.
I mean, the trick here is whether, just if I can go back to the CRs are costly, but the trick here is timing. How long, what's the risk of the wait? In a transition year, despite, whoever comes in, whatever party comes in, there is always a period of time, sometimes very substantial, to do a relook. I think during the Bush administration, there was actually pretty quick action to increase the defense budget, but there is a huge risk. So, of course, that could be a strategy, but timing on it, who comes in, what the contents of it are, constraints, those are all risks. So I would, I'm sure the Defense Department would really want to get this taken care of as soon as they can within a year.
Just flip it back. I mean, this is a strategy. This notion that somehow we're going to rely on the next president to come in. It basically means the defense hawks and the Congress can't prevail. That's how you have to read it. It's basically they're submitting to one of two things. right? That they just want to put kind of fidelity to Paul Ryan, help that guy out, not create another headache for him, or they know they can't defeat the Freedom Caucus. What it doesn't mean is somehow they've made, kind of, no, actually things are okay, and we don't require more investment in resources. So everybody expects the next administration to come in and tinker with what the previous administration has left them. The way we are thinking about, in the case of the GOP hawks, defense hawks in the House, is they were going to say, okay, let's go ahead and give them, a bump so the baseline now is $20 billion higher than they would have otherwise received when the next administration came in. And so in that respect, punting it down to the next administration means they really haven't done anything to advance and set the table, as I mentioned before, for the next administration. And listen, I started out talking about spoilers. The Freedom Caucus, can't go ahead and do anything to effectuate their budget priorities. They can only bring down Paul Ryan's. And the question is whether or not defense hawks are able to do anything other than to stop a budget, or will they be able to add resources? And again, we're just talking about a blueprint, because none of it will be executed anyway. But it actually helps the next administration, if they're so inclined, to point to that budget blueprint and say, hey, that's the direction we want to go. Andrew?
Yeah, Todd, I would say I'm a notorious fan of OCO, and I'm not going to depart from that position because I think it's been tremendously valuable, and certainly on this issue of adaptability and agility. But having said that, it does have a downside, and the downside is you can't, and as you've pointed out, it's not predictable in the future. And so if OCO is the answer, but it's the answer this year, and next year we fall off a cliff again, you're really no better off than you were. So that's one point. The other point I would make is I think, and Roger has really said it, I think it's not so much about the identity of the next president, or even that there is a next president. It doesn't answer anything, because the problem is still the caps, which are statutory. And so, and if the Congress is struggling this year to even deal with a cap that has been agreed upon, and to what about those caps that nobody likes that are still in place in FY 18 and 19 going forward? So that's the crucial, and it is, as Roger said, it's all about other than defense discretionary. It's about non-defense discretionary. It's about mandatory spending. That's where the solution will be found. That will eventually feed back into the defense accounts.
Mark, a final comment before our time's up.
Let me put my OMB hat on, which makes me a little nervous since I'm flanked by comptrollers here.
I was at OMB.
Okay, there you go. All right. So maybe I'll get some support there. The first thing is on the CR, keep in mind that because the 17 levels are essentially the same as the 16 levels, you don't have this problem about a big jump. So the amounts aren't that big a deal. There is a problem about authorities that, for a short period isn't that big a deal, but when you start going 6 months or more, then that becomes a big deal. On the question of OCO, and my observation coming from OMB is that last year the Budget Committees proposed to add $38 billion to OCO, and that passed the Congress. Now, the administration wouldn't accept it, but it strikes me that if they tried to add some smaller amount, 18 billion or whatnot, that might make it through the Congress. I mean, the administration won't accept it, but that might be the marker that they put down. And I mean, you're nodding. I have to defer to the people who know the career a little better, but just based on what they did last year, that might be an approach.
It's the only play to add resources.
Yeah.
That's just the bottom line.
All right. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us and being so generous with their time, and thank all of you for coming.